I'll be speaking with Marta Rodriques from Puerto Rico. She's a member of the Amer Jubran Defense Committee. He has been given a 10-year hard labor sentence in Jordan. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Stan. How are you?
Good. So explain what happened. What did you learn last year about this case?
Well, Amer Jubran is someone that I had known to begin with because I used to live in Boston back in 2002 when he was still living in the city, and we both, along with other people, did work on Palestine. So we kept in touch after he went back to Jordan. And last year, I was called by friends who informed me that they couldn't get a hold of Amer, that his phone was not being answered, which was unusual. And eventually someone managed to get a hold of his family and was informed that he had been detained without charges on May 5th and that no one knew his whereabouts or the status, in what physical condition he was in. His family was not able to see him, and because no one knew where he was, no one was able to get a lawyer to him so that he could consult with one.
Mm-hmm. And that continued for some time.
That continued until it was close to 2 months. I don't remember if, in June we still didn't know what was going on, and throughout much of July either.
Mm-hmm. And I understand the Lawyers Guild was contacted and sent a letter?
Yes, the subcommittee, the Palestine subcommittee of the Lawyers Guild wrote a letter to the Jordanian embassy in Washington expressing their concerns about the condition in which Amer had been detained.
Mm-hmm. Did they get an answer?
No.
Mm-hmm.
No, none of us did. We would call the Jordanian embassy for weeks and weeks, and they would say that someone would be looking into it, that they would, get hold of the Jordanian government and would have answers for us, and they never got back to us.
So then after a couple months, what happened?
After a couple of months, I believe in the beginning of August, he was instructed of so-called terrorism charges. Now, what's interesting about many of the charges against him is that they pertain to new legislation that was approved after his arrest. And under these new charges, certain types of speech, certain types of writing, which in the view of the Jordanian government could harm their relationship with a foreign government, could be considered acts of terrorism. So he was charged, among other things, with endangering the relationship of the Jordanian government with foreign governments. But, the law is so vague that it can mean that certain types of activism, even certain types of journalism, could be considered terrorism. And what's more disturbing about the whole situation is that at the time that Amer was arrested, the type of work that he did, writing against the U.S. and Israel's policies toward the Arab region, those acts, which under this new legislation became illegal, they were not illegal at the time of his arrest.
Mm-hmm. And it's a matter of speaking and writing. We're not talking about making bombs or things like that.
Well, he was essentially arrested for the activism that he did, which was essentially writing and speaking. Now, later on, we learned that he was forced to sign confessions that he was not able to read prior to signing them. And I personally have not seen the particulars of these confessions, although they involve supposed acts of terrorism. But they were essentially obtained through torture and through threats against his family.
Did he say what kind of physical things were used against him?
He, from what I haven't seen the specific charges contained within the confessions. I know that during the process of interrogation, they wanted him, among other things, to become, because he used to travel to Lebanon to do like lectures on Palestine. And so they wanted him, because he traveled to Lebanon to do this, they wanted to introduce him back into Lebanon as an informant against the Lebanese resistance, which he did refuse. And, because he refused, he was told that essentially that would be looked at in his sentencing. And, oh, by the way, he was told that his sentencing would be done, decisions about his sentencing and what was to become of him after the trial would be done in coordination with the United States and Israel.
In Jordan.
Yes.
But the charge he's made that he was tortured, how did that come out? Through a lawyer later on, or did he tell somebody?
No, the lawyer, he obviously, indicated it to the lawyer. And the lawyer essentially raised it within the course of the trial itself.
But,
and the judges, and the torture included being interrogations that lasted for periods that went up to 72 hours, being deprived of sleep, being constantly beaten, threats against the family. Apparently during the beatings there would be periods of time when he and the people that were arrested with him would faint, and they would be reanimated rather violently. This chemical called acetone would be hurled in their faces as a means of reanimating them.
Now, what does the Jordanian government said about this? Was it covered in the Jordanian newspapers? I mean, I did some Google searches and I didn't see any statements in the Jordan Times or anything like that.
No, the Jordanian government, as far as I know, has not made any statements concerning his arrest or his sentence. I mean, the only statements they've made so far has been, the statements of the court of the GID, the General Intelligence Directorate. There's a tribunal called the State Security Tribunal, which interestingly enough is controlled by the General Intelligence Directorate, which is essentially the Jordanian secret police. Many of the judges are recruited from those people, from either the military or the secret police. And they said, the only thing they said was that they did not need to take into account the evidence that was presented by the defense, that they considered it irrelevant. And then they, proceeded to, initially they sentenced him to 15 years prison and hard labor, and then somehow the defense was able to get the sentence reduced to 10 years. But essentially, it's still, it's an obscene sentence in light of the fact that it was derived at upon evidence that was obtained through torture, and in light of the fact that the judges were rather blatant about saying that they didn't even present any kind of justifiable cause for not taking into account the defense's evidence.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What have human rights groups and others said about this? The High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations is himself a Jordanian. Has he commented? I know you folks have written to him. What has he said about this case?
What I understand is that the documentation of the court has been asked for, and also there's a human rights group that constantly monitors what's going on in Jordan. They're called Al-Karama. And they, at the time of Amer's arrest, presented a complaint to the UN Committee on Arbitrary Detentions on his arrest. And they will also be lodging a complaint against Jordan through the Committee Against Torture on November 9th, when Jordan goes up for its third review.
Mm-hmm. But how about that Jordanian prince who's the High Commissioner? Has he responded to your letters?
No, so far no.
I see. Is Amnesty International aware of the case? Have they taken action?
Amnesty International has been made aware of the case, and recently they wrote back asking for some more information.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Could you tell me about your personal interest in Palestinian justice issues? How did that come about?
Well, I'm Puerto Rican, and the United States invaded Puerto Rico in 1898, and we have experienced sort of like parallel situations of invasion and of exile. In our case, half of our population, for instance, has been driven out of Puerto Rico, not at gunpoint like the Palestinians were, but through a process of making our own land inhospitable to us from a social and economic standpoint. But, our nation right now is divided as a result of this process of colonization and scattered throughout the U.S. and even other parts of the world, like the Palestinians. Mm-hmm. And so when I learned of their situation back when I was 15 years old, many, many centuries ago, I couldn't help but feel that there were, the parallels between us, and so that's how I became interested.
Mm. Well, finally, what kinds of things is the committee asking people to do about this case?
Right now, we are asking people, by the way, to go to our webpage, Free Amer Jubran at WordPress.com. Mm-hmm. And there's a letter that we are writing to the Minister of Justice, Minister Talhouni. And the letter is there. There's also a sample letter that people can write, can use as a guide to write their own letters if that's what they choose to do. But we're asking people to direct letters to the Minister of Justice, asking for his intervention. Right now, Amer is in the process of appealing the verdict before the Court of Cassation.
Mm-hmm.
It's the equivalent of the Supreme Court. And interestingly enough, what I understand from cassation courts, they don't necessarily examine the particulars of a case, but how the law has been interpreted. And I guess I would assume that the appeal is being made on the basis that the tribunal refused to consider any portion of the defense's evidence, that they especially refused to consider the fact that the so-called confessions that were presented before that tribunal were obtained through torture. And I would imagine that the fact that the speech and the some of the charges that were leveled against Amer, this business of endangering relations with a foreign government, none of that was illegal at the time of his arrest. And
it's a bizarre law anyway.
Yeah.
In a so-called country that respects human rights.
Yes, but unfortunately, any changes that might be made as a result of the appeal will be dependent on what kind of publicity, is generated around Jordan, and what kind of pressure from the rest of the world is brought to bear on Jordan as it considers this case. So we're asking people to direct letters to the Minister of Justice and just let them know that people are watching this case and are interested in its outcome.
Very good. Well, thank you very much for talking with me.
Thank you very much, Stan.
This has been Stanley Heller for The Struggle. Thank you all for listening.